everyone. Welcome back to the show. Today we are diving into a case that'll really stay with you. It's from a YouTube documentary called Parents Discover Their Daughter is a Mass Murderer. It's on the channel Shadowed Secrets. So this deep dive is going to take us deep into the story of Amy Dawson. She seemed like an ordinary girl, but she became Maple Hill's worst nightmare. How could someone with such a loving family and what looked like the perfect upbringing do such horrible things? That's what we'll be exploring today.
You know what's really disturbing about this case? It makes you think about what normal even means. It forces us to ask if we can ever really know what's going on behind closed doors.
Yeah.
And could there be signs that we're missing in our own lives?
Right. And the documentary really emphasizes this whole mask of normalcy thing that Amy was able to pull off for so long. I mean, Maple Hills is portrayed as this perfect all-American town, the kind of place where everyone knows each other and crime is almost non-existent. And the Dawsons, they seem like the perfect family. Karen's a nurse, David's a teacher, and they raised Amy in this safe haven.
Exactly. And that's actually where the first sign that something's off emerges. The documentary highlights how Amy was described as being unusually obedient, like almost too perfect. Now, on the surface, that might sound like a good thing, but if you know what to look for, it can be a red flag.
Wait, so being a good kid could actually be a warning sign. Can you tell me more about that?
Well, think about it. Teenagers usually rebel a little, right? It's part of growing up, figuring out who they are. But Amy, she didn't seem to go through that phase at all. She just followed all the rules, did great in school, and never went against what her parents said. Now, this could point to some deep emotional detachment, like maybe she was never able to make real connections with people.
Wow, that is a really different way to look at it. It's like she was acting like a good kid without really feeling it. But if she was so good at hiding her true self, how did anyone realize something was wrong?
Well, cracks in that facade started to show up when Amy was in high school. The documentary mentions that her teacher started noticing some disturbing changes, like her artwork started to get really dark and violent, and she started pulling away from her friends and stopped doing things she used to enjoy.
Well, those do sound like classic warning signs, but couldn't that just be normal teenage angst? I mean, lots of kids go through phases like that, right?
Of course, teenage angst is real, but it's important to pay attention to what else is going on. Like in Amy's case, these changes in her behavior, plus those disturbing themes in her art. They were early warnings that something more serious might be going on. Sadly, those signs were missed or dismissed as nothing to worry about.
Okay, so we're starting to see how Amy was able to fool everyone around her. But how did she go from a troubled teen to an actual murderer? What was the thing that set it all off?
Well, the documentary then shifts to this series of murders that terrorized Maple Hills.
Yeah.
And they got worse and worse. It starts with a drifter who was found dead in the woods, then an elderly woman, then a teenage boy, then a young mother. Each murder was more brutal than the last. The whole town is obviously terrified and everyone's on edge, but no one suspects Amy because she's off at college, living a normal life.
Wow. Talk about a double life. But how long could she keep this up? Did no one suspect her at all?
Not at first. And that's what makes this case so scary. Amy was able to separate her life so well she could commit these horrible crimes and then just go back to her dorm room. She blended in with her classmates. No one had a clue. It's this ability to keep up a normal front that lets people like Amy go unnoticed for so long.
It's terrifying to think someone could be that good at lying. But the truth had to come out eventually, right? What was the turning point in the investigation?
The turning point was Amy's journal. Her parents found it hidden under her mattress when they were cleaning her room.
Oh, wow. You know what they say? Curiosity killed the cat. Well, this is one case where curiosity uncovered a monster. What did they find in the journal?
They found something more horrifying than they could have imagined. The journal had detailed descriptions of each murder. It was all written in chilling detail. But the most disturbing part wasn't the gore. It was the complete lack of remorse. Amy actually described feeling a sense of exhilaration, of power, as she committed these brutal acts.
So not only was she documenting her crimes, but she was enjoying them. It's like she was keeping score, treating human lives like trophies. That must have been absolutely devastating for her parents. What did they do with this horrifying discovery?
Imagine finding out that about your own child. The documentary shows how Amy's parents struggled with this impossible choice. Do they protect their daughter or turn her over to the police? It's a heartbreaking decision. And in the end, they do the right thing.
I can't imagine what they must have gone through. It's like their whole world fell apart. But how did Amy react when they confronted her? Did she try to explain herself?
The documentary shows Amy's arrest, and it's chilling. No tears, no asking for forgiveness, no signs of guilt or shame at all. She just stares blankly at the officers when they read her rights. It's this creepy calmness, this emotional detachment that really starts to show the psychological complexity of what we're dealing with here.
Wow. It sounds like the mask of normalcy finally came off, and the monster underneath was revealed. So with the journal as evidence and Amy in custody, I'm guessing things moved pretty quickly from there.
Right, with that journal as evidence, the case against Amy moved really fast. The trial became huge news, everyone was talking about it. But even as the trial was going on, Amy remained a total mystery.
It's like her not showing any emotion made her even scarier. Like she was a puzzle no one could figure out. Did the trial give any clues about why she did it?
Well, during the trial, Amy actually confessed to the murders.
Hmm.
But it wasn't a, tearful, remorseful confession or anything like that. It was cold, calculated, almost like she was talking about the weather. She explained that she'd been having these violent fantasies since she was a kid, and that she killed those people because she needed to feel powerful and in control.
Power and control. It's like she was trying to dominate a world that she felt totally separate from. That seems to be a theme in a lot of true crime cases. But what's really interesting here is that this wasn't some random spur of the moment thing. Amy planned each murder very carefully. She chose her victims specifically, and she seemed to enjoy the fear she was causing. It's almost like she was playing some kind of sick game.
That's a really good point.
Hmm?
The documentary focuses on that premeditation aspect. It wasn't just about killing, it was about the planning, the waiting, the messing with people's heads. That level of planning is what makes Amy's case so different.
So this wasn't just a case of a troubled teenager snapping, right? This was something way darker, much more planned out. But what about her parents? Did they have any idea what their daughter was capable of? The documentary mentioned that they thought her extreme obedience was a good thing. Did the experts have anything to say about that?
Yeah, they interviewed a bunch of psychologists for the documentary, and they had some really interesting insights into Amy's early life. They said that Amy being so obedient could have actually been a sign of a deeper psychological issue, something called reactive attachment disorder.
Reactive attachment disorder. I've never heard of that. What is it?
Basically, it's a rare but serious condition. It can happen in kids who've been severely neglected or abused when they're very young. These kids have a hard time forming normal emotional bonds with the people who are supposed to be caring for them. Now, Amy wasn't neglected in the usual way, but the experts suggested that her emotional detachment might have come from a similar inability to connect with her parents on a deeper level.
So even though she had a loving family and a stable home, something was still missing. It's like she was emotionally starved. And that emptiness came out in these horrific ways. It's a reminder that even in families that seem perfect, things can go terribly wrong.
That's right. And the experts really emphasize that early intervention is key in cases like this, if there are signs of emotional detachment, violent fantasies, or disturbing behavior. Getting professional help is so important. It's not about labeling kids. It's about giving them support and maybe preventing a tragedy.
Absolutely. It's so important to remember that anyone can have mental health problems, no matter their background or how they were raised. But what about Amy's artwork? The documentary mentioned that her art teacher noticed her style becoming darker in high school. Could that have been her way of asking for help?
It's definitely possible. Creative things like art or writing can be a window into what's going on inside someone's head. In Amy's case, those dark and violent themes in her art. They could have been her way of dealing with her disturbing thoughts and fantasies.
Like, she was trying to tell someone something, but no one understood? Makes you wonder if things could have been different. Like, if someone had recognized those signs and stepped in, could this have been prevented?
That's the question a lot of people ask in these cases. It shows how important it is to pay attention to those little signs that something's wrong with young people and to create environments where they feel safe talking about their feelings and asking for help.
Okay, so we've talked about Amy's early life, her emotional detachment, and the chilling details of her crimes. But what about the impact on Maple Hills itself? The documentary mentioned that her crimes shattered the town's sense of security. How did the community react to this?
Imagine a town like Mokel Hills, where everyone leaves their doors unlocked and kids can play outside without worry. Suddenly, that sense of safety is completely gone. The documentary shows how fear and suspicion took over, parents became super protective, neighbors started distrusting each other, and that idyllic small-town life completely fell apart.
It's like the town lost its innocence. And the fact that the killer was one of their own, someone they thought they knew, that must have been incredibly painful.
It was. There was a deep sense of betrayal, of disbelief, that someone raised in their community could do something so horrible. It shows that evil can hide in plain sight. And sometimes the people we think we know best are the ones who can hurt us the most.
And for Amy's parents, it's a double tragedy. Not only is their daughter a murderer, but they also lost their nephew, John. He was one of her victims. That just adds another layer of heartbreak to an already horrific story.
It does. The documentary doesn't hold back on showing how devastated Amy's family was. Their community turned on them. They had to sell their home and move to get away from the whispers and judgment. They lost their daughter to the darkness inside her. And then they lost their nephew to her violence. It's an unimaginable amount of grief and guilt to carry.
It's like they lost everything. Their daughter, their family, their community. Their story shows that violence hurts so many people, not just the direct victims. It leaves behind a wave of pain and trauma that can affect generations.
That's a powerful point. And the documentary really does a great job of showing all the complex ways Amy's crimes affected people.
So we've covered Amy's childhood, the horrifying details of her murders, and the devastating impact on her family and her town. But what about Amy herself? What happened after the trial? What's her life like in prison? So we've talked about Amy's past and, all the damage her crimes caused. But what about her now? The documentary didn't just stop with her conviction. It went inside the prison to show how she's handling life behind bars. What did they find?
It's pretty wild, right? You'd think someone like Amy would fall apart under a life sentence. Maybe show some remorse or at least be scared, right? But that's not what happened at all. The documentary shows that she adjusted to prison life amazingly well, almost like it was too easy for her.
Like she actually does better in that kind of structured, controlled place.
Didn't they say she even got a certain reputation among the guards and the other inmates?
Exactly. They interviewed prison staff for the documentary, and they described Amy as intelligent, manipulative, and like a pro at playing mind games. It's like her need for control, that same thing that drove her to kill, found a new way to come out in prison.
So even in a place that's supposed to take away your power, she finds a way to get it back. It's kind of creepy to think about. But did she ever say she was sorry for what she did? Did those prison psychologists make any progress with her?
Not really, no. The documentary makes it clear that all through her time in prison, Amy never showed any remorse. She never really admitted the pain she caused. She even said something like, the murders were necessary, which is just chilling, It shows a total lack of empathy. That's something you see a lot with psychopaths. It's like she just can't grasp the impact of what she did on other people. That kind of detachment is really scary. So while she's serving her life sentence, the people in Maple Hills are left to deal with the aftermath. The documentary doesn't just focus on Amy, it shows how her crimes affected the whole community. What did they find?
The documentary is really powerful in how it shows the effects of trauma. Maple Hills used to be this picture of safety and innocence, and then it became a community broken by fear and suspicion. Parents were constantly worried. Kids had nightmares. And the trust that held the town together was completely shattered.
Like a wound that never heals. The documentary even shows how some parents started taking their kids to see psychologists. They were terrified that their own kids might have those same dark urges.
Yeah, that's a natural reaction.
Yeah.
When something so horrible happens and it shatters your sense of security, you start questioning everything. It speaks to that deep fear every parent has, The fear of not knowing what's going on inside their own child's mind.
And it's not just the parents. The documentary also shows the impact on the police. They were criticized for not putting the pieces together sooner, for missing those early warning signs.
Absolutely. There's this feeling of guilt, like they should have known, they should have done more. And that often leads to changes in how police do things. More surveillance, more anxiety. It affects everything.
So even though Amy's locked up, her presence is still felt in Maple Hills, like a shadow hanging over the town. And then there's her family, especially her parents. The documentary shows how they were basically shunned by their community. They had to move and start over with this huge weight of shame and judgment on them.
It's a truly heartbreaking story. They lost their daughter to this darkness that took her over. And then they lost their nephew, John, because of her violence. The documentary shows their grief, their guilt, their struggle to understand how the daughter they raised could become the person she did.
It's like a double tragedy, a nightmare they can't wake up from. It really shows that the families of criminals are victims too. They carry the shame, the burden of what their loved one did, and that awful question, why?
You're right. And it reminds us that these crimes have so many victims.
So we've explored the psychology of Amy Dawson's case, from her seemingly normal childhood to those calculated, brutal crimes, and the trauma she inflicted on her community and her own family. We've learned about reactive attachment disorder, the mask of normalcy, and the terrifying reality of psychopathy. What's the takeaway here? What does this deep dive tell us about ourselves and the world we live in?
It's a question that stays with you, right? This deep dive makes us confront some hard truths about human nature. It makes us question our ideas about good and evil, about families, and about the potential for darkness to exist, even in places that seem perfect.
Definitely a lot to think about. But I think there are some important lessons here. We've learned about how crucial early intervention is, about noticing those small signs that something's wrong, and about creating places where people feel safe asking for help. We've also seen how damaging trauma can be, and how important it is to support victims and their families.
I agree. And maybe the biggest takeaway is that we can never really know what's going on inside someone else's mind. We can be more aware, more compassionate, more careful. But in the end, there's a part of the human heart that will always be a mystery.
Well, that's our deep dive into the disturbing case of Amy Dawson. It's a story that makes us rethink what we thought we knew, forces us to face some uncomfortable truths, and leaves us with way more questions than answers. But that's what a real deep dive is all about, right? Exploring the complexities, understanding the nuances, and having those tough conversations that help us understand ourselves and the world a little bit better. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time for another deep dive here on The Deep Dive.